It was 11:53 at night when Steph Curry found himself kneeling in the silence of his room, his hands intertwined in prayer, trying to process news that had shaken not just the basketball world, but his very soul. The soft light from the bedside lamp created an atmosphere of sacred contemplation, while silent tears ran down his face, carrying the weight of a loss that went far beyond sports. To understand how a final conversation between two men of faith forever changed Steph Curry's perspective on purpose, legacy, and the divine plan behind his career, we need to go back to that Sunday night, just 5 days before, when two souls who shared much more than passion for basketball had a conversation that would become prophetic in ways neither of them could imagine. You can perceive that sometimes God uses seemingly casual conversations to plant seeds of transformation in our hearts, conversations that only reveal their true meaning when we look back through the lens of eternity, realizing that what we thought was coincidence was actually divine purpose unfolding. 5 days earlier, the Staples Center had witnessed another epic battle between the Warriors and the Lakers, one of those games that reminded fans why they loved basketball. Steph had finished with 31 points and 8 assists, a solid performance that contributed to the Warriors' 6-point victory. But what happened after the game would be far more significant than any statistic recorded on the score sheet. Kobe Bryant was in the Staples Center parking lot talking with Robert Kim, one of the pastors who frequently ministered to NBA athletes. It was a scene that had become familiar over the years. Kobe always found time for spiritual conversations, especially after home games, when the adrenaline of competition gave way to reflection on greater purposes. "He's maturing in ways that go far beyond basketball," Kobe was saying, his eyes following Steph as he walked toward the family car. "There's something different about Steph lately, a depth that wasn't coming just from game experience, but from spiritual growth." Pastor Kim, who had known both players through his ministry with professional athletes, nodded in recognition of the insight. "You're right. He's carrying himself with more spiritual weight, as if he's being prepared for something greater." Something that touches deeply is observing how spiritual mentors can detect internal transformations before even the person realizes they're being molded for a specific purpose, as if they had divine vision to see potential that's still being developed in someone's heart. It was at that moment that Steph, noticing Kobe and Pastor Kim talking, approached them. There was a deep mutual respect between Steph and Kobe that had developed over the years, not just as competitors, but as men who understood the weight of representing something greater than themselves through sport. "Kobe," Steph said, extending his hand in a greeting that carried years of respectful battles on the courts. "Good game tonight." "Always is when you're playing," Kobe replied, that characteristic smile appearing on his face. "But I didn't come here to talk about basketball. I was talking with Pastor Kim about you." Steph looked between the two men, intrigued. "About me?" "About what God is doing in your life," Pastor Kim clarified. "Kobe was observing your spiritual journey and noticing changes. How is it possible that others can see transformations in us that we ourselves are still processing?" Steph had indeed felt something different in his relationship with God lately, a sense of being prepared for something, a holy restlessness that suggested God had specific plans for his next steps. "You know, Steph," Kobe said, his tone gaining that seriousness that appeared when he spoke about important matters, "I've been watching your career not just as a player, but as a man of faith. And there's something I need to share with you." The trio moved to a more reserved corner of the parking lot, where they could talk without interruptions. The cool breeze of the Los Angeles night created a perfect atmosphere for deep conversations. Those moments when men who are normally guarded about emotions Find space to speak about matters of the heart. You have a gift that goes far beyond making baskets, Kobe began, looking directly into Steph's eyes. God has given you a platform that can reach multitudes, but more important than that, He's given you a heart that can touch them. Steph felt something move deeply in his spirit as Kobe's words resonated. There was a prophetic quality in the way Kobe spoke, as if he were seeing something that hadn't yet manifested completely. In the coming years, Kobe continued, you're going to discover that your true calling isn't just to be a great basketball player. Your calling is to be a light for multitudes who need hope, an example of how it's possible to use success to serve God's kingdom. Pastor Kim watched the conversation in silence, recognizing those rare moments when God uses one person to speak directly to another's heart. When human words become vehicles for divine revelation, isn't it incredible how God sometimes uses the most unexpected people to deliver messages we need to hear? How He can speak through competitors, through colleagues, through people we barely know, when our hearts are open to receive divine direction? I've been feeling that, Steph admitted, his voice loaded with genuine emotion. Especially lately. Like God has been preparing me for something different, something greater than just basketball. Exactly, Kobe said, placing a hand on Steph's shoulder in a gesture that carried spiritual weight. And when that moment comes, and it will come sooner than you imagine, you're going to need the courage to completely embrace what God is calling you to do. What kind of thing? Steph asked, genuinely curious about the vision Kobe seemed to have about his future. Kobe looked at the starry sky for a moment, as if he were receiving revelation in real time. Ministry, Steph. Not just giving occasional testimony, but using your platform in ways that transform lives eternally. God is going to use you to reach young people who would never step foot in a church, but who will hear every word you say. What's most impressive is how sometimes we receive divine confirmation through other people about directions our heart was already feeling, as if God used external voices to validate internal whispers we were afraid to fully trust. Would you two like to pray about this? Pastor Kim suggested, recognizing they were in the middle of a spiritually significant moment. Without hesitation, the three men formed a small circle there in the Staples Center parking lot. Cars passed occasionally, people left the arena, the normal life of the city continued around them. But in that space, they created a temporary sanctuary where they could seek divine direction. Pastor Kim led the prayer, his voice carrying years of experience ministering to athletes who struggled to balance fame with faith. Heavenly Father, thank you for this moment of fellowship among brothers. We ask that you clearly reveal to Steph the plan you have for his life, that you give him courage to walk in obedience when you call him to greater steps. Kobe prayed next, his words surprising Steph with their spiritual depth. Lord, I see something special in Steph that I know comes from you. Use him powerfully in the coming years. Make him an instrument of hope for multitudes who need to see how it's possible to live with eternal purpose. When it was Steph's turn, he felt a special anointing descending upon him. God, thank you for these brothers you're using to speak to me. If you really have specific plans for my life beyond basketball, give me clarity to recognize them and courage to obey them, no matter the cost. Naturally, this leads us to understand that sometimes the most transformational moments of our spiritual lives happen not in formal religious settings, but in unexpected places where sincere hearts come together to seek God's will. When they finished praying, there was a palpable sense that something significant had happened. Not just a conversation among friends, but a moment where eternal plans had been partially revealed, where seeds of destiny had been planted in soil, prepared by years of spiritual growth. "Steph," Kobe said as they prepared to say goodbye, "remember this conversation. There will come a moment when you'll need to make decisions about using your platform in ways that may surprise even you. When that moment comes, remember that God was already preparing you for it." "I promise," Steph replied, feeling spiritual weight in Kobe's words that he couldn't completely explain. "And one more thing," Kobe added, that characteristic intensity shining in his eyes. "When God begins to open these doors for ministry, don't be afraid to be vulnerable. People need to see that heroes also struggle, also need salvation, also are dependent on God's grace." The three men embraced in a farewell that carried meaning beyond the casual. Pastor Kim said goodbye first, leaving Kobe and Steph talking for a few more minutes about family, faith, and the challenges of living with purpose amid the pressures of fame. "Let's keep in touch about this," Kobe said finally. "Actually, how about we meet next week to continue this conversation? I feel like God has more things to reveal about your next steps." "I'd love that," Steph replied, genuinely enthusiastic about the prospect of exploring more deeply the vision Kobe had shared. They arranged to meet the following Friday, a conversation that would never happen, plans that would be interrupted by a tragedy no one could predict. But the words Kobe had planted that night were already germinating in Steph's heart, spiritual seeds that would grow in ways neither of them could imagine. Great leaders don't just play the game, they serve the creator of the game. And on that Sunday night, Steph had received a vision about how he would be called to do exactly that, through prophetic words from a man who saw spiritual potential where others saw only athletic talent. 5 days later, as Steph prayed in his room processing the devastating loss, those words echoed in his heart with new intensity, carrying the weight of divine promise that would now have to be fulfilled without the earthly guidance of the man who had spoken them, but with the certainty that God had used Kobe to plant seeds of eternal destiny that would flourish regardless of circumstances. It was 3:15 in the morning when Steph finally got up from the floor of his office, his knees aching after 2 hours of intense prayer that had begun as lament and transformed into desperate search for divine understanding. The Bible was open to Psalm 23. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Words that had gained completely new meaning in the last 72 hours. Kobe's prophetic words echoed in his mind like a sacred echo that refused to be silenced, mixing with his pain for the sudden loss of the man who had become much more than a respected rival. He had become a brother in faith, whom God had used to reveal eternal purposes. You can perceive that sometimes God allows us to go through dark valleys not to punish us, but to prepare us, using even our most devastating losses as fertile ground where seeds of purpose planted earlier can finally germinate with intensity that prosperity alone could never produce. Steph walked silently through the house, stopping before each family photo that decorated the corridors. In each image, his daughters laughing during vacations, Isha smiling in moments of celebration, moments of victory that once seemed to be the pinnacle of his blessings, he now saw something different. He saw platform. He saw responsibility. He saw opportunities for eternal impact that Kobe's words had opened his eyes to see. During the last 3 days, since the news of the tragedy shook the world, Steph had found himself caught in a cycle of emotions that oscillated between deep grief and growing spiritual restlessness. It was as if Kobe's sudden departure had accelerated a divine timer, creating urgency about promises that had been made in a conversation that now gained prophetic weight. In the kitchen, Steph prepared a cup of tea, his movements automatic while his mind revisited every word of the final conversation with Kobe. Ministry, Steph, using your platform in ways that transform lives eternally. The words seemed to have been engraved in his soul with sacred fire, impossible to ignore or forget. How is it possible that words spoken in life gain exponential power after the death of the one who spoke them? Steph was discovering that prophetic declarations carry authority that transcends the physical presence of those who made them, as if they were divine messages delivered through temporary human vessels. The soft sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted his thoughts. Isha appeared in the kitchen, wearing a robe and with an expression of maternal concern he had learned to recognize over years of marriage. "Baby, are you awake again?" she asked, approaching him with that natural way Christian wives offer support without making judgmental questions. "I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Kobe," Steph admitted, his voice carrying emotional weight he had been carrying alone. "Isha, he said things about my future, about ministerial calling, that I can't get out of my head." Isha sat beside him at the kitchen table, that space that had witnessed thousands of family conversations, but which now became a sanctuary for processing divine revelation. "Tell me exactly what he said." During the next 20 minutes, Steph shared every detail of the final conversation with Kobe. The words about ministerial platform, the prayer in the parking lot, the vision about reaching multitudes who would never step foot in a church. As he spoke, he saw recognition growing in Isha's eyes. "Steph," she said when he finished, "remember when Pastor Carlos Martinez spoke about people being chosen for specific seasons? Remember how you became restless during that sermon, as if something was moving in your spirit? Something that touches deeply is when Christian spouses serve as confirmation for each other about divine directions, when matrimonial love becomes an instrument through which God validates callings that could seem too audacious to accept without earthly support." Steph vividly remembered that sermon from 3 months ago. Pastor Carlos had spoken about how God sometimes prepares people for years for specific moments of impact, how he plants holy restlessness long before revealing the complete purpose. Steph had felt something deep stir in his spirit that day, but hadn't been able to articulate what was happening. "Do you think God was preparing me for this?" Steph asked, genuinely seeking confirmation from someone whose spiritual perception he deeply respected. "I think Kobe saw something that God was already doing in you," Isha replied, placing a caring hand on his arm. "And I think his departure created urgency about something that could have taken years for you to fully embrace." Isha's perspective brought clarity that Steph hadn't been able to find alone. Perhaps the tragedy wasn't just devastating loss, but also divine catalyst for acceleration of eternal purposes that were already in motion. "I want to call Pastor Kim," Steph said, feeling clear direction for the first time in days. He was there that night. He heard Kobe's words. "Maybe he can help me process what this means." Isn't it incredible how God frequently uses faith community to help us interpret spiritual directions that could seem overwhelming when processed in isolation? Pastor Kim had been a spiritual mentor to several professional athletes over the years, navigating the unique territory of balancing fame with faith. Even though it was early morning, Pastor Kim answered the call on the second ring, as if he had been expecting contact from Steph. "Brother, how are you dealing with all this?" "Pastor, I can't stop thinking about the conversation with Kobe," Steph said without preamble. The things he said about ministry, about God using me to reach multitudes, was that on your mind too? Steph, Pastor Kim replied, his voice carrying the weight of shared revelation. I've been praying about that conversation every day since it happened. And I can say with certainty that Kobe was operating in prophetic word that night. He saw something about your spiritual future that comes directly from God's heart. Pastor Kim's confirmation hit Steph like a wave of divine validation. Here was someone with years of ministry experience confirming that his restlessness wasn't just a grief process, but response to legitimate calling. But how do I know when to act on this? Steph asked. How do I know when God is giving me the green light for such big steps? Through consistent prayer and multiple confirmation, Pastor Kim replied, God doesn't call us to blind leaps. He confirms directions through His Word, through circumstances, through faith community that knows our heart. What's most impressive is how God creates confirmation systems for important directions, using multiple voices and circumstances to validate callings that could change entire life trajectories, ensuring we don't confuse emotional impulses with divine guidance. Pastor, would you pray with me now? Steph asked, feeling the need to seek God corporately about next steps. Of course. And is Isha there? Let's pray together as spiritual family. The three connected in prayer through the phone, creating a moment of divine intimacy that transcended physical distance. Pastor Kim led with wisdom developed through years of counseling athletes at spiritual crossroads. Heavenly Father, you took our brother Kobe home, but the words you spoke through him continue to be alive and active. Give clarity to Steph about your timing. Show him when and how to take greater steps of obedience to the calling you've placed in his life. Steph prayed next, his voice gaining strength as he found vocabulary for anxieties and hopes he had been carrying. Lord, I know you used Kobe to speak to me about greater purpose. I don't want to waste this revelation through fear or hesitation, but I also don't want to run ahead of your timing. Give me wisdom to discern your voice amid all the emotions. Isha concluded with a prayer that touched the heart of the matter. God, protect Steph's heart during this process. Don't allow him to be moved by guilt or external pressure, but only by genuine love for you and for people you want to reach through him. Naturally, this leads us to understand that processing divine callings requires not just individual wrestling with God, but also wisdom and support from spiritual community that can help us distinguish between our own agenda and genuine direction from the Holy Spirit. When they finished praying, there was palpable peace that had been absent during the last few days. Not all questions had been answered, but direction was becoming clearer, as if spiritual fog was slowly lifting. Steph, Pastor Kim said before hanging up, I want you to consider something. Kobe isn't the first one God used to plant seeds about your ministerial future. Remember the conversation we had about your influence on young people 6 months ago? Remember how you felt that same restlessness when we discussed using your platform differently? Steph remembered. There had been a series of conversations over the last year where different people had mentioned similar themes about his potential for kingdom impact beyond basketball. It was as if God was creating a pattern of confirmation, using multiple voices to point to the same direction. I suggest you spend tomorrow in prayer and fasting, Pastor Kim continued. Ask God for specific guidance about timing and steps. And if you feel clear direction, we can meet later this week to discuss practical implications. I'll do that, Steph confirmed, feeling more peaceful than he had been since the tragedy happened. After ending the call, Steph and Isha remained seated in the kitchen in comfortable silence, both processing the weight of the conversation that had just occurred. It was obvious that something significant was happening in the spiritual realm, something that would require careful navigation, but also carried promise of eternal impact. "Baby," Isha said finally, "whatever God is calling you to do, you're not alone in this. Our family is with you. Our church community is with you. And, most importantly, God is with you." Steph pulled his wife into an embrace that carried gratitude not just for her support, but for how God was using even the grieving process to open doors for greater obedience and deeper purpose than anything he had previously imagined. Great leaders don't just play the game, they serve the creator of the game. And Steph was beginning to understand that his greatest games might not be played on basketball courts, but in the lives of people God wanted to reach, through the platform years of excellence had created. As he prepared to return to bed, Steph knew that the next day of prayer and fasting would bring clarity about how to honor both Kobe's memory and the calling God had planted through their final conversation together. It was a sunny Thursday when Steph Curry found himself sitting in the ESPN studio, his hands slightly trembling not from nervousness about cameras, something he had become accustomed to over years of career, but from the magnitude of what he was about to share with the world. After 3 days of prayer and fasting, crystal clear clarity had emerged about what God was calling him to do. The decision to speak publicly about his final conversation with Kobe hadn't been taken lightly. It had been the result of multiple confirmations: the peace that descended during family prayer, the unanimous encouragement from his faith community, and above all, a deep conviction that honoring Kobe's memory meant giving life to the prophetic words he had spoken. You can perceive that sometimes God positions us in moments of choice where our obedience not only benefits our own spiritual journey, but becomes a catalyst for impact on lives we don't even know are watching, waiting for an example of how it's possible to live with eternal purpose amid temporal success. James Wilson, the veteran ESPN journalist who would conduct the interview, had known both Steph and Kobe over years of covering the NBA. There was something different in the air that afternoon, not the typical energy of routine sports interviews, but an atmosphere of reverence that precedes moments when athletes share deeper aspects of their personal journeys. "Steph," James began after the initial formalities, "you specifically asked to speak about your last conversation with Kobe. I know this must be difficult, but I also know you feel it's important to share." Steph took a deep breath, feeling divine presence in a way he had learned to recognize during moments when God was about to use his voice for purposes greater than entertainment. "James, in the last few days, I've been praying a lot about whether I should share this publicly, and I feel God is giving me direction to honor Kobe's memory by telling about our final conversation." The mention of prayer and divine direction in the context of a sports interview created a perceptible shift in the atmosphere. James Wilson, himself a man of faith, immediately recognized he was about to witness something more significant than typical basketball analysis. "Tell us about this conversation," James said, leaning slightly forward with full attention. Steph closed his eyes for a moment, as if accessing a sacred memory that needed to be treated with maximum care and precision. "It was after our game against the Lakers last week. I was leaving the Staples Center when I saw Kobe talking with Pastor Kim in the parking lot. He called me over and said he wanted to talk to me about something important." How is it possible that conversations that seem casual in the moment can carry prophetic weight that only reveals itself completely afterward? Steph was discovering that God frequently uses apparently coincidental encounters to plant seeds of destiny that will flourish in perfect timing. "Kobe said something that's still echoing in my heart," Steph continued, his voice gaining spiritual strength as he found courage to verbalize words he had guarded as secret treasure. "He looked directly into my eyes and said, Steph, your true calling isn't just to be a great basketball player. Your calling is to be a light for multitudes who need hope. The studio became completely silent. James Wilson, accustomed to decades of interviews with athletes, instantly recognized he was hearing something extraordinary. Not just recollection of conversation, but revelation of prophetic vision that had changed a life trajectory. He continued, Steph said, tears beginning to form in his eyes, talking about how God would give me opportunities to use my platform in ways that would transform lives eternally. He said, I would reach young people who would never step foot in a church, but who would hear every word I said. Something that touches deeply is observing how authentic prophetic declarations carry authority that transcends the personality of those who speak them, creating instant recognition in the hearts of those who hear them that they are in the presence of divine truth being revealed. And then, Steph continued, his voice breaking slightly with emotion, we prayed together there in the parking lot. Kobe, Pastor Kim, and I. Kobe prayed asking God to use me powerfully in the coming years, to make me an instrument of hope for multitudes. James Wilson was visibly moved. Steph, how have these words impacted you since the tragedy? Steph wiped tears from his eyes before responding. James, in the last few days I've been in intense prayer about this, and I feel God is confirming that Kobe saw something about my future that I myself hadn't completely perceived. I feel he planted seeds of calling that now need to be honored through action. What's most impressive is how God sometimes uses devastating losses to accelerate obedience to callings we could have taken years to fully embrace, transforming grief into motivation for eternal impact that simultaneously honors memory of loved ones and divine purposes. What does this mean, practically, for you? James asked, recognizing he was documenting a transformational moment in the career of one of the world's most influential athletes. It means I can no longer see my platform just as an opportunity for entertainment or even casual inspiration, Steph replied, conviction growing in his voice. It means I need to be intentional about using every opportunity to point people to real hope, to eternal purpose, to relationship with God that can transform lives. Steph's response created immediate waves in the sports world. It wasn't uncommon for athletes to mention faith occasionally, but rarely did someone articulate such specific and direct ministerial calling in the context of conventional sports media. Steph, James said, clearly touched by the vulnerability he was witnessing, you're talking about fundamental change in how you see your career and influence. Exactly, Steph confirmed. Kobe saw something God was preparing in me for years, and his departure created urgency about not wasting time or opportunities God places before me. Naturally, this leads us to understand that sometimes the most powerful legacy we can leave isn't personal achievements, but lives we touch through obedience to divine callings that may seem risky for our public image, but are essential for our eternal purpose. Can you share something specific about how this will manifest? James asked. Steph had been expecting this question, having prayed extensively about how much specificity to share publicly. I'm working with my wife and our church to develop initiatives that go beyond basketball. Spiritual mentorship programs for young athletes, partnerships with organizations that address social issues through the lens of faith, and more opportunities to give public testimony about how God can use people in any field for kingdom impact. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but those initial moments when Steph shared Kobe's prophetic words had already created impact that would reverberate through the sports world and beyond for months to come. Within hours after the broadcast, social media exploded with reactions. Fellow athletes, many of whom knew both Steph and Kobe personally, expressed amazement at the depth of Kobe's spiritual insight. Coaches spoke about having witnessed similar moments when Kobe demonstrated wisdom that went far beyond basketball. Marcus Williams, former teammate of Kobe, tweeted, "This is exactly the Kobe I knew, always seeing potential in people they didn't see in themselves yet. Steph, he was right about you." Tyler Brooks, sports analyst who had covered both players extensively, wrote, "In decades covering the NBA, I've rarely seen an athlete articulate calling so clearly. Steph Curry just changed the conversation about what it means to be an influential athlete." But perhaps most significantly, hundreds of messages began pouring in from young people who said Steph's vulnerability in sharing Kobe's prophetic words had inspired them to consider their own life purposes differently. Pastor Kim, who had witnessed the original conversation, released a statement. Kobe was operating in genuine prophetic gifting that night. Seeing Steph step into obedience to that calling is a beautiful example of how God continues to work through people even after they're called home. Anthony Zhang, sports psychology expert who worked with Christian athletes, noted, Steph Curry just demonstrated courage that most public figures never find, willingness to risk career image for obedience to spiritual calling. That kind of authenticity creates impact that goes far beyond sports. At the end of that day, Steph returned home to find Isha and daughters waiting with expressions of pride and support that confirmed he had made the right choice in sharing Kobe's prophetic words publicly. "Daddy," Riley said, "I watched your interview. It made me cry, but also made me proud that you had courage to honor Mr. Kobe through obedience." "And you know what else?" Ryan added with characteristic enthusiasm. "Now I understand better why God gave you such amazing talent. It's not just for entertaining people, but for pointing them to Jesus." Steph pulled his family into a group hug that seemed to seal commitment, not just to honoring Kobe's memory, but to walking into whatever plans God had for using their family's platform for eternal impact. Great leaders don't just play the game. They serve the creator of the game. And through sharing Kobe's prophetic words about his destiny, Steph had taken the first major step toward becoming the type of leader his friend and mentor had envisioned. Someone who would use extraordinary platform for extraordinary kingdom purposes, touching lives in ways that would reverberate through eternity.